Environmental collapse and the Palestinian genocide are both fueled by imperialist colonial capitalism. For millennia, the delusion has endured amongst uncivilized, I should say, nations, that nature is bounty, there to serve human ends. When neoliberalism and its latest manifestation as techno-feudalism have the added accelerant of the fossil fuel economy, the suicidal delusion at the heart of the global economic system becomes horrifyingly evident. Like the genocide in Gaza, it is playing out before our eyes if we care to look. You cannot care for Palestinians or anyone else without a struggle to maintain the ecological conditions necessary for them to thrive. Some observant Jewish environmentalists use the same word, churban, catastrophe, to stand for the destruction of the temple, the Nazi Holocaust, and the sixth mass extinction through which we are currently living. We might also call that a Nakba. Genocide is a subcategory of ecocide. The onslaught on Gaza has used environmental destruction deliberately to further Israel's crimes against humanity. The links between the fertility of land and life are well understood by the perpetrators. The destruction of trees, greenhouses, crops is fully integrated into the genocide. To this, we have to add wider planetary destruction from the immense quantities of emissions from air flights and munitions during this and other military campaigns. The carbon footprint during the first 15 months of the Gaza conflagration equaled the total annual emission from 100 countries. Palestine, the Middle East, like everywhere else, is heating up, but at twice the global average. Areas of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait are becoming uninhabitable because of extreme temperature rises. There's a water shortage across the region. Iran is considering the evacuation and relocation of its capital city, Tehran, because of climate change-induced collapse of the water table. It may follow in the footsteps of Jakarta, Indonesia, affected both by depletion of the aquifer and rising sea levels, with wide areas of the city expected to be inundated by 2050. We do not grasp impending environmental catastrophe if we focus only on climate collapse, without considering loss of biodiversity and out-of-control pollution. That narrow focus is itself a form of denial. The depletion of soils and disruption of the food chain through the overuse of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. A decline in the numbers of animals and birds by 70% in 50 years. A reduction of more than 90% in insect populations in some areas of the world. There are parts of China where there are no bees. Feather dusters are being used to pollinate crops. A national emergency briefing from 10 environmental experts at Central Hall, Westminster, on November the 27th, 2025. It illustrated the impacts of a deteriorating environment on weather extremes, increased danger of tipping points, food security, health, the economy, energy transition, biodiversity, and national security. Its format improved on the government's tepid briefings for the COVID pandemic. It showed up the neglect of their obligations of this and past governments to protect citizens from environmental disasters. The briefing should have been live streamed by government and shown on every TV channel, but was not. Of the experts giving evidence, Kevin Anderson came closest to naming capitalism as the driving force behind the destruction of nature. However, insurance companies are also foretelling the end of capitalism if we fail to act. The ex-CEO of Allianz Investment Management, Gunther Tallinger, said in April 2025, the world is already approaching temperature levels where insurers will no longer be able to cover many climate risks. At 2 degrees or 3 degrees centigrade of global heating, there's no way to adapt to temperatures beyond human tolerance. That means no more mortgages, so no new real estate development, no long-term investment, no financial stability. The financial sector, as we know it, will cease to function, and with it, capitalism, as we know it, ceases to be viable. Despite such pronouncements, Allianz remains a major investor in fossil fuels, as well as providing insurance services to the Israeli military. It would be a bittersweet experience to live long enough to witness the end of capitalism. We might say to each other when it happens, it would be good to celebrate in happier circumstances. The graph shows the accelerating rise of CO2 levels, and this is one way I remind myself of the reality of climate breakdown. The Earth has not experienced present CO2 levels for millions of years. My parents were born at 300 parts per million. I was born at 310 parts per million, and we're now at 426 CO2 parts per million. Human civilizations developed at concentrations below 300 parts per million, the level to which life on Earth is well adapted. 350 parts per million is seen as a relatively safe level, keeping global temperature rises below 1 degree centigrade. According to James Hansen and other climate scientists, it is a level to which humanity must strive to return. In Cambridge, we mourned and buried 1.5 degrees centigrade of global temperature increases on May of 2025. In 10 years, according to Bill Maguire, we may have passed 2 degrees centigrade unless there's an unprecedented phase out of fossil fuels. In the possible lifespan of my grandchildren, without dramatic change now, the world will become barely hospitable. The 30 COPs can be viewed as only markers on this relentless rise in CO2 levels, as shown in the above so-called COP curve. Global weather patterns have remained relatively stable in part because of consistent circulating ocean currents. The AMOC, or Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, transports warm water northwards and cold water southwards. It is weakening. Changing temperature gradients may bring dramatic, unpredictable weather changes, including to us in Northern Europe, with much colder winters and hotter summers. Then there is the land ice melts in Antarctica and Greenland. This is the Thwaites Glacier, sometimes called the Doomsday Glacier, the size of the UK, melting into the sea, pushing up global sea levels. Rob Larter of the Cambridge Antarctic Survey has said that this and other land-based ice melts make it utterly crazy to continue with plans to resolve the water shortages in the Cambridge area by a reservoir in the low-lying fens. Yet, it is being built. I doubt it'll be finished. So is the pen mightier than the sword? Can we write and talk in such a way that all this horror comes to an end? We write, we march, we give speeches, we show solidarity to each other. We often know that we change little when it's imperative that we change a lot. I have to give Tom Stoppard a mention because of his recent death. His character in Henry Act 2, Scene 5, says tentatively, I don't think writers are sacred, but words are. They deserve respect. If you get the right ones in the right order, you might nudge the world a little, or make a poem that children will speak for you when you're dead. The avenues for creating change through argument have narrowed. I felt that constriction from the 1980s, when good argument in my university was increasingly trumped by the exertion of power. So up against institutional or state power, or indeed F-35s, the claim for the power of self-expression, the pen is mightier than the sword, sounds hollow. Actually, I'd expected to trace that phrase to the Bible or Shakespeare, but found it's from an 1839 play by a not very celebrated politician and playwright, Edward Bulwer Lytton. He also contributed the name of an annual award for the worst opening line to a story with his "It was a dark and stormy night." It is a dark and stormy night. We need mass direct action if we're to build a movement to counter the F-35s. But we also need the writing, the analyses, the plays, the poetry to sustain ourselves and the struggle. We deny reality. After hearing Margaret Thatcher's announcement outside 10 Downing Street that we are a grandmother, I started to call the neoliberal hypercapitalist ideology she helped to popularize grandchild murder. I think she loved her son Mark, but I don't think she cared about the way capitalism was robbing future generations. More recently, I Latinized the ideology, denying the impacts of both hypercapitalism and environmental breakdown as nepoticide. Nepoticide was illustrated in an action in Cambridge in 2019, initiated by Extinction Rebellion youth. They wanted to show dramatically the sacrifice of future generations. It felt extremely uncomfortable pouring fake blood over our young comrades, but it was visually compelling, including the involvement of our Red Rebels, and gained considerable publicity. I think that many people avoid considering the fate of future generations because they deny their own mortality. If they cannot face their own mortality, how much harder it must be to contemplate the mass extinction of their descendants and billions of other people and creatures. 20 years ago, I was in Mexico City, and when I realized the city would shortly be celebrating Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, I delayed my flight home. I wanted to experience this Mexican attitude to death. My Mexican colleagues involved me in community celebrations. I went to an exhibition at the National Art Gallery and was confronted near the entrance hall by this painting. It's called Allegory of Death, Alegoria de la Muerte, painted by the Mexican artist Tomás Mondragón in 1856. The words on the bottom right of the picture translate as, "This is the mirror that does not deceive you." I must have seemed shocked, since a woman gallery attendant came over to me and placed her hand gently on my arm, saying quietly, "Es realidad." It's reality. Denial is also powerfully fueled by misinformation and greenwashing from oil, gas, and coal corporations, fed by their perverted love for capitalist growth and destruction. I call them an Armageddon cult. They're constantly lobbying for new recruits. Greedy, misguided creatures of the night, like Tony Blair, seek them out like moths to a flame. I hate the mendacity of the Armageddon cult, but I love the word. I learnt it when I first watched Tennessee Williams' Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and heard Brick, the alcoholic son, mourning the death and lost love of his male best friend, hating his wife, knowing that his father has terminal cancer, but is denying it. He spat out these words. Mendacity, you know what that is. It's lies and liars. You said it yourself, Big Daddy. Mendacity is a system we live in. It's not always easy to know which side people are on. Genevieve Gunther noted the remarkable comments from Ursula von der Leyen, President of the EU during COP30, and said this: at the very moment the EU was supposedly fighting to include a roadmap to fossil fuel phase-out in the COP decision, Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, was telling a press conference at the G20 that we are not fighting fossil fuels, we are fighting the emissions from fossil fuels. Guenther says this displays a lack of courage. I think this is too kind. Von der Leyen implies that we can keep using fossil fuels and focus on removing the emissions from them. Climate scientist Kevin Anderson sees this belief as a dangerous fantasy, that we can move from capturing 0.03 emissions from using fossil fuels, as we do at present, to removing the overwhelming amount of emissions. This is evidence to me of the capture of the EU president by the Armageddon cult. I think that to engage with reality about the depletion of nature and climate breakdown involves passing through a portal of consciousness, and in that process, leaving denial behind. On the way from my house to the station, there's a rectangular slab of supposed public art with a large hole in the middle. I call it the portal. A few years ago, I told my grandchildren that on arriving into Cambridge from France, they had to pass through this portal and show their passports. They liked the idea. Whenever they walk to or from the station, they clamber through it. I invite all those who haven't done it yet to pass through the portal that separates denial from facing the harsh reality of environmental breakdown. Humans are highly skilled in being able to hold two apparently incompatible beliefs at the same time. Many people claim to know all about the threats from climate and biodiversity breakdown and pollution, yet do not recognize the urgency for action. When we face up to the horrors of genocide in Gaza, we take it personally, and we have to feel the same for environmental breakdown. I don't think we can say that we have passed through the portal until we feel it in our bones. We need multiple changes to undo the impulse to exploit the rest of nature. Alongside a profound change in the economy, we need a cultural, personal, spiritual shift in our relationship to other beings, to see animals and plants as kin, living within a connected network of ecosystems. Indigenous people have shown for millennia how harmony with the natural world can be nurtured. I think that a healthier, sustainable relationship to the natural world lurks within many of us, ready to recognize that we are part of nature and dependent on its flourishing. We can see the natural world as essential infrastructure for all the nested ecosystems on the planet. That would turn upside down the crime of interfering with key national infrastructure under Section 7 of the Public Order Act 2023. Key national infrastructure is what nature defenders are trying to protect. I had great pleasure reading an Ofsted report a decade ago for a small Norfolk school. The inspectors had visited the school when many of the children were involved in forest school activities in the nearby ancient wood, Lion Wood. At one point, an inspector asked of the children, "Who owns this wood?" A child replied, "Nobody owns the wood. The trees and the animals own the wood." I imagined afterwards that this disruption of the conventions of land ownership was so upsetting to this inspector that after a few more challenges to his ideas of land and property ownership, including the house he shares with millions of tiny creatures, he has a heart attack, which is mean of me, though I didn't kill him off in my story, not straight away. A just transition away from a fossil fuel economy, which preserves what we can of a future for our descendants, requires the biggest and swiftest changes to be made in the richest countries and by the wealthiest in all countries. This is a conclusion using simple arithmetic of where the bulk of emissions are located. It is likely to be supported by the leaders of the 24 countries meeting in Colombia in April 2026 to produce a route away from fossil fuels. It will certainly be repeated in the next iteration of the National Emergency Briefing. But it is also a direct change to capitalism, echoing Naomi Klein's title of truth. This changes everything, capitalism versus the climate. We need to continue to spell that out. Protest against the Armageddon cult must continue, including non-violent direct action and as much mass mobilization as we can muster. I like the guidelines for direct action produced by the young Serbian nature defender Sergej Popovic, deeply involved in the toppling of Milosevic. He reminds us that activism should not be boring, calling for us to engage with humor and art and to avoid adopting gurus. We know that in our corner of the world, protest is being outlawed by successive repressive governments. On Friday, a friend was sentenced to 26 months in prison for climbing the N25 gantries to try to stop future oil extraction. But the struggle has to continue. I remember, as I talk, all the many political prisoners, many without charge or trial in the UK, imprisoned for standing up against genocide in Palestine and the destruction of planet Earth. I think of the regular murder of nature defenders in South America, and I also return my focus as I think of my young Cambridge friend volunteering with Médecins Sans Frontières in the south of Sudan, having spent a month last year in Gaza. I return my focus to all those suffering from apartheid, ecocide, genocide in Palestine. And finally, let me reiterate, facing reality is the only secure basis for hope. Thank you.